June 1942. The North Atlantic, just 15 miles off the coast of Long Island. A German U-boat commander raises his periscope for a routine scan of the horizon, expecting to see nothing but open water and perhaps a few merchant vessels. What he sees instead stops him cold. Rising from the morning haze, impossibly close, impossibly massive, the skyline of New York City. The Empire State Building. The Chrysler Building. Dozens of skyscrapers piercing the sky, their windows catching the early sun, glittering like a wall of glass and steel. He's been hunting American ships for weeks, prowling these waters, sinking tonnage. But he never imagined he was doing it within sight of the largest city in the Western Hemisphere. The shock doesn't end there. Within hours, his U-boat will be depth-charged, damaged, and forced to surface. His crew will be captured and brought aboard an American destroyer. And as they stand on the deck, wet, exhausted, defeated, they'll see it again. That impossible skyline. Closer now. Real. Undeniable. Many of these German submariners have spent the entire war being told that America is on the verge of collapse. That British propaganda has exaggerated American industrial capacity. That the United States, stretched thin across two oceans, cannot possibly sustain a war effort. They've been assured that Germany's U-boat campaign is strangling Allied supply lines, that American cities are darkened by fear, that victory is only a matter of time. But standing on that destroyer deck, looking at the New York skyline, at buildings taller than anything in Berlin or Hamburg, at a city showing no signs of dimming its lights, at a harbor filled with ships being built faster than U-boats can sink them, the propaganda crumbles. In that moment, many German submariners realize something their high command either doesn't know or refuses to acknowledge. Germany cannot win this war. This is the story of Operation Drumbeat, the U-boat campaign that brought the Battle of the Atlantic literally to America's doorstep. It's the story of young German sailors who thought they were winning a war, only to discover they were fighting an industrial giant they never truly understood. And it's the story of how sometimes the most devastating weapon isn't a torpedo or a depth charge. It's simply the truth, visible on the horizon, impossible to deny. Between January and August 1942, German U-boats operated with near impunity along the American East Coast, sinking hundreds of ships within sight of shore. American beaches were littered with oil and wreckage. Residents could see ships burning on the horizon. It was one of the most successful U-boat campaigns of the entire war. And yet, it was also the beginning of the end for Germany's submarine force. Because every U-boat commander who saw that skyline, every captured submariner who was brought through New York Harbor, carried back a message that would ripple through POW camps and eventually back to Germany itself. America is not what we were told. The industrial capacity is real. The cities are untouched. The war production is just beginning. This is a story about the power of perception, about the danger of believing your own propaganda, and about the moment when reality becomes impossible to ignore. To understand why seeing the New York skyline was so shocking to German submariners, we need to understand what they'd been told about America and what they expected to find. The German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, had entered World War II with a submarine force far smaller than what Admiral Karl Donitz believed necessary. Donitz had calculated that Germany needed at least 300 operational U-boats to successfully blockade Britain and strangle Allied supply lines. In September 1939, Germany had 57 submarines, and only about 20 were capable of Atlantic operations. But what the U-boat force lacked in numbers, it initially made up for in effectiveness. The early years of the war saw German submarines achieving remarkable success against Allied shipping. The happy time of 1940 and early 1941 saw U-boats sinking merchant vessels faster than they could be replaced. German submariners developed an almost mythical reputation, skilled hunters operating in wolf packs, slipping through convoy defenses, sending thousands of tons of Allied shipping to the bottom. The crews of these U-boats were young, highly trained, and indoctrinated with Nazi propaganda about German superiority and Allied weakness. They were told that Britain was starving, that American industrial capacity was exaggerated, that the war would be won through submarine warfare. Many genuinely believed that their actions were bringing Germany closer to victory. Captain-Lieutenant Reinhard Hartigen commanded U-123, one of the submarines selected for Operation Drumbeat, Paukenschlag in German, literally drumbeat or drumroll. Hartigen was 28 years old, confident, aggressive, and thoroughly convinced of Germany's inevitable triumph. He'd already sunk multiple Allied ships in previous patrols. When he received orders to take his submarine across the Atlantic to operate off the American coast, he saw it as an opportunity for glory. The operation was planned for January 1942, just weeks after America's entry into the war following Pearl Harbor. Admiral Donitz selected 5 submarines for the initial wave: U-123, U-125, U-66, U-130, and U-109. The mission was simple: cross the Atlantic undetected, position themselves along the American East Coast, and begin sinking merchant shipping. What Donitz and his commanders understood, but perhaps didn't fully communicate to their submarine crews, was that this was as much a psychological operation as a military one. The goal wasn't just to sink ships, it was to bring the war to America's doorstep, to show American civilians that their cities were vulnerable, to undermine confidence in the U.S. Navy's ability to protect its own coastline. But there was a fundamental miscalculation at the heart of German strategic thinking about America. The Nazi leadership, including Hitler himself, consistently underestimated American industrial capacity, organizational ability, and political will. This wasn't just propaganda for public consumption, this was genuine belief at the highest levels of German command. The young men serving on U-boats absorbed this worldview. They were told that America was a mongrel nation, weakened by diversity, corrupted by capitalism, incapable of matching German military prowess. They were shown intelligence reports emphasizing American unpreparedness, highlighting U.S. Army equipment shortages, pointing to isolationist sentiment in American politics before Pearl Harbor. When U-123 and the other Operation Drumbeat submarines departed France in December 1941, their crews expected to find an America in chaos, cities darkened by blackouts, harbors empty of shipping, a nation paralyzed by fear and unready for war. Some genuinely believed they might help force American surrender or at least a negotiated peace. The reality they encountered was startlingly different. As the U-boats approached the American coast in early January 1942, commanders were stunned to find that coastal cities were fully lit. There were no blackouts. Ships sailed with navigation lights burning. Lighthouses operated normally. It was like hunting in a shooting gallery, easy targets everywhere, almost too easy. But there was something else. Something that didn't fit the narrative they'd been fed. The sheer volume of shipping, the constant activity in American ports, the evidence of massive industrial production, it suggested an economy operating at full capacity, not a nation on the verge of collapse. Hartigen's U-123 sank its first ship, the British freighter Cyclops, off Cape Cod on January 12, 1942. Over the following days, U-123 and the other Drumbeat submarines would sink dozens of ships along the East Coast. The campaign was a tactical success beyond German expectations. By February, U-boats had sunk over 60 ships in American waters. The Allies were losing the Battle of the Atlantic and losing it spectacularly close to American shores. But the strategic picture was more complicated. Every U-boat patrol that brought submarines close to the American coast also brought German sailors close enough to see what America actually looked like. And what they saw didn't match what they'd been told. The spring of 1942 saw an intensification of U-boat operations off the American East Coast. More submarines arrived. The hunting remained easy, American coastal defenses were inadequate, convoy systems hadn't been properly implemented, and merchant ships continued to sail alone in predictable patterns. For the German submariners, it should have felt like victory. They were achieving kill ratios that U-boat commanders in other theaters could only dream of. Ship after ship went to the bottom. Oil slicks covered miles of ocean. The American press called it torpedo junction. But something was changing in how the submariners viewed their mission. The ease of the hunting, combined with what they could observe of American activity, was creating cognitive dissonance. How could a nation this vulnerable also show such clear evidence of massive industrial capacity? The moment of truth came differently for different crews, but the pattern was similar. A U-boat would approach close enough to the coast to see the skyline. The periscope watch would call the commander, and there it would be, New York or Boston or another American city, completely lit up, showing no evidence of a nation under siege. 4 U-558, operating off New York in May 1942, the encounter was particularly striking. Captain Lieutenant Gunther Kreck brought his boat to periscope depth just after dawn, positioning for an attack on a coastal convoy. What he saw through the lens made him call his executive officer to confirm it wasn't an optical illusion. The Manhattan skyline, perhaps 20 miles distant, was clearly visible in the morning light. The Empire State Building, at that time the tallest building in the world, dominated the view. Dozens of other skyscrapers surrounded it. The harbor was filled with ships. And most striking of all, there was no evidence of damage, no sign that this city was at war. Kreck later reported in his war diary, though carefully phrasing it to avoid seeming defeatist, that the sight had given him pause. He noted the impressive scale of American construction and observed that propaganda reports may have understated enemy industrial capacity. But the real shock came for those U-boat crews who were captured and brought into New York Harbor as prisoners. This is where the propaganda met reality most directly, where German submariners couldn't rationalize or explain away what they were seeing. U-352, under Captain Lieutenant Helmut Rathke, was depth-charged and sunk off Cape Lookout, North Carolina, in May 1942. 33 crew members survived and were picked up by American Coast Guard vessels. As they were transported to shore and eventually to POW processing in New York, they got an extended look at American coastal cities and industrial facilities. Several crew members from U-352 later described the experience in interviews conducted in POW camps. One torpedo man, whose name appears in Allied intelligence reports only as Muller, told interrogators that seeing New York Harbor made me understand for the first time that we could not win this war. He described watching Liberty ships being launched, seeing the Brooklyn Navy Yard operating at full capacity, observing the scale of American port facilities. Another submariner from U-352, a machinist's mate, was even more direct. We were told American factories were primitive, that their ships were poorly made, that their production was minimal. We could see with our own eyes that this was false. Everything was false. The propaganda had been specific. German submariners had been shown images of American poverty during the Depression, told that American industrial capacity had collapsed, assured that the United States could not possibly supply both its own military needs and provide material to Britain and the Soviet Union. They'd been given intelligence estimates suggesting American ship production was perhaps a tenth of what it actually was. Standing in New York Harbor, watching multiple Liberty ships under construction simultaneously, seeing the evidence of industrial organization on a scale that didn't exist anywhere in Germany, the lies became impossible to maintain. But it wasn't just the captured submariners who experienced this cognitive dissonance. U-boat commanders who survived their patrols and returned to base in France brought back disturbing reports. The official war diaries were careful and circumspect. No U-boat commander wanted to be accused of defeatism. But the private conversations among submarine officers revealed growing doubt. They'd been sinking ships at unprecedented rates, and yet American shipping didn't diminish. They'd been told that each 1,000 tons sunk brought German victory closer, and yet new ships appeared constantly. The mathematics didn't work. The propaganda didn't match reality. Admiral Donitz, receiving these reports, faced a dilemma. He had known from the beginning, that the U-boat campaign was a race against time. Sink ships faster than they could be replaced, and Britain starves. Fail to sink them fast enough, and Allied industrial production would eventually overwhelm the submarine fleet. But he believed, or at least argued to Hitler, that Germany could win that race. The reports from the American coast suggested otherwise. The United States wasn't just replacing ships, it was building them faster than even the most pessimistic German estimates had predicted. The Liberty ship program, which German intelligence had initially dismissed as impossible, was producing vessels at a rate of 3 ships every 2 days by mid-1942. For the young men serving on U-boats, this growing awareness was psychologically devastating. They were still following orders, still hunting ships, still risking their lives in one of the most dangerous jobs in any military. But an increasing number privately doubted that their sacrifices would lead to victory. The war diary of U-154, operating off Bermuda in June 1942, contains an unusual entry. The commander, Captain Lieutenant Walter Call, noted seeing what he estimated as at least 50 merchant vessels in a single day, all apparently sailing to or from American ports. He added, in what for a German military document was remarkably candid language, that the scale of enemy shipping suggests previous intelligence estimates require substantial revision. This was as close as a U-boat commander could come to saying, "We've been lied to, and we might be losing." By the summer of 1942, the easy hunting off the American East Coast was ending. The U.S. Navy had finally implemented effective convoy systems. Coastal defenses were improving. Air patrols were becoming more frequent and more effective. The Americans were learning, adapting, and most importantly, building. The statistics tell a stark story. In the first 6 months of 1942, U-boats sank over 400 ships in American waters. It was a devastating blow to Allied shipping. But in that same period, American shipyards launched over 500 new vessels. The mathematics that Admiral Donitz needed to work, sinking ships faster than they could be replaced, wasn't working anymore. 4 captured German submariners. Life in American POW camps brought continued exposure to the reality of American industrial capacity. Camps were often located near industrial facilities, where prisoners could see and hear evidence of American production. Some prisoners were even employed in agricultural work, traveling through American communities, observing civilian life largely untouched by war. The intelligence officers who interrogated captured U-boat crews noted a pattern. Initial interrogations, conducted immediately after capture, often showed submariners who were still confident, still believing in German victory. But after weeks or months in American custody, after seeing more of the country, that confidence eroded. A report from Fort Meade POW camp in Maryland, dated October 1942, noted that captured submariners show increasing demoralization as they observe American industrial activity and civilian prosperity. The report added that some prisoners had begun expressing private doubts about German propaganda claims. This psychological impact wasn't limited to captured submariners. Those who survived patrols and returned to base in France brought back the same troubling observations. The informal networks of communication among U-boat crews meant that these doubts spread. Veteran submariners would tell new recruits, "Don't believe what you hear about America. It's different than they tell you." Admiral Donitz attempted to counter this growing demoralization by emphasizing tactical victories and downplaying strategic realities. U-boat crews were given statistics about tonnage sunk, told about British food shortages, reminded of German technical superiority. But it was increasingly difficult to maintain morale when submariners could see that no matter how many ships they sank, more appeared. The broader impact of Operation Drumbeat and the subsequent U-boat campaign off America's coast was complex. Tactically, it was initially successful. Hundreds of ships sunk, thousands of Allied sailors killed, millions of tons of war material sent to the bottom. This success forced the Allies to divert resources to coastal defense, delayed some supply shipments, and demonstrated that American waters were not safe. But strategically, the campaign may have actually harmed Germany's position. It brought the war directly to American shores, galvanizing public opinion and eliminating any remaining isolationist sentiment. Americans saw oil-covered beaches and burning ships on their own coastline. The response was not fear or calls for negotiation, it was fury and determination. More importantly, the close-up view of America that U-boat operations provided to German submariners created a pool of witnesses who knew the truth about American capacity. Every captured submariner became, in effect, evidence that Germany's propaganda was false. And in the closed world of POW camps, where thousands of German prisoners were eventually housed, this truth spread. By 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic was turning decisively against Germany. Improved Allied anti-submarine technology, especially centimetric radar and long-range aircraft, made U-boat operations increasingly dangerous. Allied code-breaking, through the Ultra Project, allowed convoys to avoid wolf pack positions. And American shipbuilding had reached such a scale that even peak U-boat effectiveness couldn't match it. The submariners who'd seen the New York skyline understood this before the official statistics made it undeniable. They'd seen the truth with their own eyes. And that truth was devastating. Germany was fighting an enemy with industrial resources that made victory mathematically impossible. The story of German submariners shocked by the New York skyline represents a broader truth about World War II. The Axis powers consistently underestimated Allied, and especially American, industrial capacity. This wasn't just a failure of intelligence, it was a failure of imagination, compounded by ideological blindness. The Nazi leadership's racial ideology made it almost impossible for them to accurately assess American strength. They believed that a diverse, democratic society would be weak and divided. They convinced themselves that capitalism would prioritize profit over effective war production. They assumed that American political culture would prevent the kind of total mobilization that Germany achieved. Every assumption proved catastrophically wrong. American democracy turned out to be far more resilient than German dictatorship. American capitalism proved remarkably efficient at converting from civilian to military production. And American society, far from being divided and weak, demonstrated extraordinary unity and sacrifice in support of the war effort. The German submariners who saw this reality firsthand became living proof of German miscalculation. In POW camps across America, these men described what they'd seen. Their testimony wasn't just anecdotal. It was systematic, verified, impossible to dismiss as Allied propaganda because it came from Germany's own military personnel. Allied intelligence services recognized the value of this. Interrogation reports from captured submariners were analyzed for what they revealed about German morale, awareness, and psychological state. What emerged was a picture of a military force that had started the war confident and was becoming increasingly demoralized as reality contradicted propaganda. This pattern wasn't unique to U-boat crews. German prisoners of war across all services showed similar evolution in their understanding. But the submariners who'd operated off the American coast had something others didn't: direct, undeniable visual evidence. They'd seen it with their own eyes. The Empire State Building, the harbor filled with ships, the cities ablaze with light. The legacy of Operation Drumbeat is therefore paradoxical. It achieved tactical success that made it one of the most effective U-boat campaigns of the war. But it also exposed German submariners to the reality of American strength, contributing to the demoralization of the U-boat force and providing evidence that undermined the propaganda-sustaining German war effort. In the broader sweep of World War II history, this story matters because it illustrates how propaganda, even when believed at the highest levels of command, eventually collides with reality. You can tell your military personnel that the enemy is weak, but when they can see with their own eyes that the enemy is strong, the propaganda fails. The thousands of German POWs held in America during the war became witnesses to American society. Many were shocked by what they saw: prosperity, industrial capacity, civilian life continuing largely uninterrupted by war. For men who'd been told that America was on the verge of collapse, that Allied bombing had devastated British industry, that German victory was inevitable, the evidence of their own eyes was devastating. After the war, many of these former POWs spoke about their experiences. Their testimony reveals how completely Nazi propaganda had shaped their expectations, and how dramatically reality differed. Some felt betrayed by their own leadership, which had either been ignorant of the truth or had deliberately lied to them. Among the German submariners captured off the American coast, individual stories reveal the human dimension of this propaganda versus reality collision. Oberleutnant Zur C. Peter Czech commanded U-505, which operated off the American coast in 1942. Czech survived his patrol and returned to base in France, but his war diary reveals a man struggling with cognitive dissonance. He described the unexpected scale of American coastal activity and noted seeing extensive evidence of industrial construction. In subsequent patrols, Czech's behavior became increasingly erratic. By 1943, facing another depth charge attack, he committed suicide in his submarine's control room rather than face capture. While multiple factors contributed to this tragedy, some historians argue that the psychological burden of knowing Germany couldn't win, while still having to send his crew into mortal danger, may have been unbearable. Contrast this with the story of Captain Lieutenant Werner Henke, commander of U-515. Henke was captured in April 1944 after his submarine was sunk in the Atlantic. Brought to Fort Hunt POW camp near Washington, D.C., Henke initially remained defiant, refusing to cooperate with interrogators and maintaining belief in German victory. But as the months passed and Henke observed American society, something changed. Fellow prisoners later reported that Henke became withdrawn and depressed. He could see preparations for D-Day, evidence of American military buildup, constant activity suggesting Allied strength. In June 1944, Henke attempted to escape from Fort Hunt, possibly seeking death rather than continued imprisonment. He was shot and killed by guards. Not all stories ended so tragically. Mechaniker Matt Hans Schmidt served on U-352 when it was sunk off North Carolina in May 1942. Schmidt was 19 years old, from a small town in Bavaria, with limited education and complete faith in Nazi propaganda. When he was pulled from the water by an American Coast Guard cutter, he expected to be shot or tortured. Instead, he received medical care, dry clothes, and hot food. Transported through Norfolk and eventually to POW processing in New York, Schmidt later described the experience as like having scales fall from my eyes. He saw American servicemen who weren't the subhumans of Nazi propaganda. He saw African-American Coast Guardsmen who treated him with the same professionalism as white sailors, contradicting everything he'd been taught about American racial hierarchies. In POW camp, Schmidt began learning English from American guards who seemed genuinely interested in his welfare. He worked on a farm in Iowa, observing American agricultural abundance. By war's end, Schmidt's worldview had been completely transformed. He later said, "The propaganda told us America was weak and divided. But I saw a strong, confident nation that barely seemed to notice the war, while Germany was destroying itself." Schmidt remained in America after the war, married an American woman, and became a U.S. citizen. He spent his later years speaking to school groups about the dangers of propaganda and the importance of questioning authority. "I was sent to destroy America," he would tell students, And America remade me into who I should have been all along. Then there's the remarkable story of the submarine crew that never surrendered but learned the same lesson. U-873 was one of the last German submarines to operate in American waters, surrendering only after Germany's official capitulation in May 1945. The crew had spent months at sea, isolated from news, still believing German propaganda about secret weapons that would turn the war. When U-873 surfaced off New England to surrender, the crew members expected to find an America ravaged by years of warfare. Instead, they saw prosperous coastal towns, a harbor filled with ships, no evidence of the destruction they'd been led to expect. One crew member later wrote, "In that moment, we understood that everything we'd believed, everything we'd fought for, was based on lies. We hadn't just lost the war. We'd never had a chance to win it." We opened this story with a German submarine commander raising his periscope and seeing something unexpected. The New York City skyline, impossibly close, undeniably real, contradicting everything he'd been told about American vulnerability. That moment, repeated dozens of times by different commanders, witnessed by thousands of German submariners, represents more than just a tactical surprise. It represents the collision between propaganda and reality, between what soldiers are told and what they can see with their own eyes. The German U-boat campaign off the American East Coast in 1942 achieved remarkable tactical success. Hundreds of ships sunk, thousands of Allied sailors killed. A genuine crisis in Atlantic shipping that threatened Allied strategy. By military metrics, Operation Drumbeat was a triumph. But it also exposed German submariners to a truth their leadership didn't want them to know. America's industrial capacity was real, overwhelming, and ultimately decisive. Every U-boat commander who saw that skyline carried back knowledge that undermined German propaganda. Every captured submariner who spent time in American POW camps became a witness to American strength. This matters because it reveals a fundamental weakness in authoritarian systems. They depend on controlling information, but they cannot control reality. You can tell your military personnel that the enemy is weak, primitive, on the verge of collapse. But when those personnel can see glittering skyscrapers on the horizon, can watch Liberty ships being built in days rather than months, can observe a civilian population living in prosperity while their own nation implements starvation rations, the propaganda fails. The Battle of the Atlantic was won by many factors: Allied code-breaking, improved anti-submarine technology, escort carriers, long-range aircraft. But it was also won by American shipyards that produced vessels faster than U-boats could sink them. And the German submariners hunting off the American coast saw this happening. They understood defeat was coming before the statistics made it official. There's a broader lesson here about the power and limits of propaganda. During the early war years, Nazi propaganda successfully convinced German military personnel that they were fighting for a righteous cause, that their enemies were weak and degenerate, that victory was inevitable. This propaganda sustained morale and motivated sacrifice. But propaganda cannot change physical reality, cannot make American factories disappear. It cannot shrink the New York skyline. It cannot hide the evidence of industrial capacity that exists on a scale beyond imagination. And when military personnel encounter undeniable evidence that contradicts the propaganda they've been fed, the psychological impact is profound. Some German submariners responded to this realization with despair, others with denial, some, like Hans Schmidt, with eventual acceptance and personal transformation. But all of them carried forward the knowledge that they'd been lied to, that the war they'd been told they were winning was actually a war Germany had no realistic chance of victory. Today, the story of German submariners shocked by the New York skyline is largely forgotten. It doesn't feature in popular histories of World War II. It lacks the dramatic appeal of major battles or the moral clarity of obvious atrocities. It's a quiet story about perception, propaganda, and the moment when reality becomes impossible to ignore. But it's worth remembering precisely because it's subtle. It reminds us that wars are won not just through force of arms, but through industrial capacity, economic strength, and the ability to sustain multi-year efforts. It shows us that authoritarian systems, despite their apparent efficiency, carry fatal weaknesses in their need to control information and manage perception. Most importantly, it reminds us that truth eventually emerges, no matter how carefully controlled the message. Those German submariners saw the New York skyline. They couldn't unsee it. The knowledge they gained couldn't be erased by propaganda or explained away by ideology. Reality, visible on the horizon, proved more powerful than any lie. The young men who served on U-boats off the American coast in 1942 thought they were winning a war. They believed in their mission, trusted their leaders, and accepted the propaganda they'd been fed about enemy weakness. Then they raised a periscope or stood on a destroyer deck and saw something that couldn't be explained away, evidence of a power and capacity that made German victory impossible. That moment of recognition, surprising, confusing, and ultimately devastating, represents a truth that extends far beyond World War II. Reality always wins in the end. The question is only how much destruction occurs before people are willing to see it.